Why play Marksmans? Well, you might have AD items that you're looking for an AD comp to play around. It is a relatively easy comp to play where it's very straightforward and it's something you can just put in your team planner and be able to kind of hit for majority of the games, very consistent. And it's also flexible with variation, so there's different carries that you can focus on in order to stabilize, different frontline units that you can stabilize around, and different ways to cap out the board once you hit level 9. So you have a lot of opportunity and options to play around different variations that can help you while you're playing the game. However, this board can be very hard to cap high. One of the big complaints with this board is that it's very basic, and a lot of the times it falls off late game, and it's hard to basically get those giga first and giga high roll, I win the game for free type of spots. A lot of the units are often very contested, especially if there's other people that have AD items. This is the go-to AD board because of how easy it is to play, as well as how you can stabilize around different units. And it's also very expensive to stabilize sometimes. If it's a lobby where there's a lot of gold and there's high rollers and people are like pushing levels, this comp can fall really far behind, and it can be hard to stabilize, especially if you don't hit 2-star upgrades on all of your units. However, it is one of the more straightforward comps, so it's probably in everybody's arsenal, which is why I think this is a good starting point for this series. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm going to be going over basically every trait in the set, similar to how I did last set, going through like how to play boards and similar content to this video. Additionally, I do other content for the set, including like mechanics, talking about items. A lot of guides like econ management and rank up guides are going to be coming as soon as my new computer / new parts come, so I can fix up my computer. But for now, we're just going to do some of the more straightforward videos because I'm going to have a hard time editing stuff. Anyways, what are marksmen? So let's introduce the trait. When you think of marksman, you should just think that is the dedicated AD trait for the set. So what do I mean by that? Basically, marksman gains attack damage. It's very simple, and then after 8 seconds of combat, they increase that bonus. So basically, the way you should think about this is if I have AD items, so works with the orange stat or the little sword icons, or I have BF swords, these are the units that are going to be very easy for you to play around. Additionally, there's a 2 and a 4 synergy, and there's 5 marksmen, so it's very easy to fit in the 4 marksman synergy. 4 marksman gives more AD, and then after 8 seconds, you gain an additional 20% AD every 6 seconds. So they also have a scaling aspect the longer a fight goes on. So what works out really well is if you can make a reliable front line, a lot of times you can get a lot of value out of the marksman trait, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But just think of it as I get AD. I get attack damage if I play this trait. So when should you play it? When you have AD items, so I don't have like the whole cool slide transitions and stuff, but basically like if you have components like an IE, or basically just general BF sword style items, those are going to work really well with the marksman trait because you're basically going to be playing towards AD carries and you're going to get a bunch of AD. You're looking for ways to scale that up, so crit chance and damage amp are things that help. Additionally, in the middle of this slide, I also put the Shojin and the Guinsu. A lot of times when you're playing around AD backline units, you either want them to cast a bunch and then you would put a Shojin on them, or you want them to attack a bunch and you want to put a Guinsu on them. Typically, when you're playing around AD carries, a Guinsu is very common because AD also scales up the auto attack. So while their ult also scales with AD, their auto attacks will as well. So that's why a lot of times you see a Guinsu pairing on those type of units. With this comp, there are carries that use both the Guinsu and the Shojin, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is why it feels so flexible a lot of the times, because if you don't get attack speed items to make like a rapid attack, like, you know, rapidly attacking unit, you don't need to do that. You can build more towards like a backline AD caster in the form of Xayah, which we'll talk about in a second. So that's part of why it's a little bit flexible and also very popular. So now we're going to go through Team Builder and we're just going to build a couple boards, and I'm going to explain like some variations and some things you can do in order to cap out those boards. But basically, when you think about marksman and you think about it, it's more of a level 8 style comp. You're usually not re-rolling. There are some other re-roll lines, but they're not really like quote unquote marksman dedicated. They're more so like, you know, you're playing around Dynamo, Jin, or what's the other guy's name? Like you're playing around Jin, or you're playing around what's his name? Kindred, her name Kindred. You're playing around one of these two units, and then that's more of like a Nitro reroll or an Exotech reroll. When I'm talking about Marksman and playing around Vertical Marksman as a trait, a lot of times what you're thinking about is Aphelios and Xayah, which are both 4 costs that share the trait of Marksman. Now, this is where the flexibility comes into play, because you can play around the two of them. You can play around Xayah as being more of like, she's kind of fallen into being more of like an AD caster. I'm not sure if that's the optimal build just yet, but for now, we're just going to go with it because, you know, I'm going to follow with the sheep, you know what I mean? And then the other one is Aphelios, who is an auto attacker that you just try and get him to attack as many times as possible, and he's more of like an attack speed style traditional AD backline carry. When you think about Xayah, she has a really good synergy with Vanguards, and so does Aphelios, because Aphelios, Golden Ox, there is a Golden Ox synergy that is in the form of Jarvan as a Vanguard for the front line. Vanguard is a frontline trait that basically, if you read it, you get a max health shield, so it helps them a lot, and then they also gain durability when they're shielded. And if you think about Xayah, what's really cool is that there is this inter-team synergy between Xayah being an Anima squad and all of these units, Leona and Silas. So you have this little little trifecta of units that shares like a little synergy tree, being that they have inter-team synergy of Vanguard and Anima squad. So a lot of times what you end up doing is playing around this core. You're going to play Vanguards with the Marksmans in the backline. When you're playing around the Vanguards, you know, there's no such thing as 3 Vanguards, either 2 or 4 or 6. So then you just throw in 1 extra Vanguard unit. A lot of times it's going to be Kayn, because Kayn is a Divinicorp. So Divinicorp will basically just give your whole team some extra armor and MR, which is great. That's Rost. Sorry, I say Kayn, but it's Rost. You know, Rost's bonus is going to be armor and MR that can help your whole team become tanky. So this is the core that you're trying to play around, and then you have some flexible options. The option that people usually go for is playing 4 Vanguard and then playing 4 Marksman, because the 4 Marksman bonus is pretty good, and it scales you really well into a team fight. So you'll usually play around these extra units, just play the more expensive ones, Jinx and Jhin. Now, these ones, they don't really matter. You're never really rerolling Jhin in a line like this, and you're never really rerolling Jinx in a line like this. So you're typically going to be playing around Xayah or Aphelios. So let's talk about our backline carries and talk about some itemizations. When you're thinking about these two units, they both gain AD in general, right? Because of the Marksman trait. They're going to get AD. Whenever you're thinking about making items for a carry, it doesn't matter what stats say. Well, it does to a certain point, but to have like an intrinsic understanding or baseline knowledge in TFT, whenever you're building for items, you want to try and make them all do different things. You want them to scale up your damage in different ways. So if you're getting a lot of AD from your trait, which is Marksman, you don't want to necessarily make like raw AD items necessarily on the units. You want to scale that up in some way to have a multiplicative effect on the damage that they output. So you want to either give them damage amp, because damage amp will multiply that, or you want to give them crit chance, because crit chance will multiply that. So a lot of times when you're looking at these units, one of the best items you can put on them is an IE. I'm just going to put them on both of them. Of course, it's maybe not the best on Aphelios, maybe not the best on Xayah, but the reason I say IE, because IE will make it so their abilities crit, and having their abilities crit, as well as their auto attacks critting, is going to scale up that base AD that you get from Marksman. Additionally, if you think about their other traits, right? Xayah being a Anima squad gives you a bit of damage amp. So you're going to get some damage amp. It's very small, so it's pretty much negligible from Anima squad. Aphelios gets Golden Ox, which also gives damage amp. It's a little bit more substantial, because especially if you get your Golden Ox rolls in, you can scale yourself well into late game. So for me, I like to have crit on them, because I'm going to get damage amp from their traits. I'm going to get AD from their traits, and then I just want to make sure that they have crit chance and their abilities are critting. Now, in terms of where the two units separate, Xayah so far has seemed to be more of a caster type unit. It's unsure if this is going to be the case all the time. It's unsure if it's going to be optimized a little bit differently, but typically you want to put a Shojin on her. Shojin doesn't really give her that many good stats. It's basically just to help her get her ult off, because a lot of her damage is tied into her ult, where she throws the feathers and the feathers return and just does an insane spread of damage and can often one-shot different units. Additionally, if you're building towards an Infinity Edge, the last item that you normally want to put is something like a Guard Breaker. I like this type of build. You see me talk about it a lot, but basically, if you want her ult to crit, there's a level of crit chance and critical strike damage. So critical strike chance is going to be pretty low. You want to pair it with other crit glove items. So a guard breaker uses a glove as part of its component. So that will raise your critical strike chance, which will make it easier for when her ult happens to actually be a critical ult, or the ult will actually be a crit. Additionally, guard breaker gives damage amp, which can also help. Your last item could be very flexible as well. Usually I go for IE and something else, but you can also go for more damage amp because she doesn't get that much damage amp if you want to scale it up that way. Utility also could work, right? If you make a last whisper, that allows you to have some sundering so you can reduce armor, but additionally it uses a crit glove, so then you can have the same effect of scaling up that critical strike chance to make sure that she's going to get a critical strike on her ult. But you can also just pair her with other items. Sometimes you'll even see like a Giant Slayer on her, even if Giant Slayer isn't the greatest item, just to give her some extra stats as well as some more damage amp, because damage amp will help you make use of all of the AD that you get from Marksman. But typically, if you have the opportunity, I would go for Guard Breaker. Now, Aphelios, however, Aphelios has an effect where he kind of scales really well by auto-attacking a bunch. So you want him to auto-attack as much as possible, so Guinsoo is pretty essential. Now, IE technically doesn't necessarily need to be on Aphelios. A lot of times you'll see different builds, like double Guinsoo, what's it called? Hextech Gunblade, because you're trying to give him sustain, right? If he just keeps auto attacking, you'll basically like kind of heal your team passively with the Hextech Gunblade effect. So you can keep your board up really long, then scale up with Marksman because you get more AD the longer the fight goes on, and then he starts like absolutely melting people. This is like a common build sometimes. I'm not a huge fan of it. I usually like to just build at least one Guinsoo. I think you need at least one Guinsoo. Then you can build either attack speed items that give damage amp, something like Guard Breaker or Giant Slayer, right? Makes a bow or made with a bow or has extra effects like that. But a lot of times I'll just put IE, Guinsoo, and then bow item, some sort of bow item. So Giant Slayer works really well because it can help out a lot. Here, Aphelios' ult isn't super essential because like he auto attacks so much, so you still get a lot of value off the Infinity Edge crit. But you can also, build for full crit with a Guard Breaker. These are all things that can make sense. I'm trying to find Guard Breaker again, right? Or a lot of times I see you just give him some starting AS, especially if you're not running double Guinsoo with red buff as an excuse for like, having a lot of bows. You can just put it on the Aphelios. But you're pretty flexible in terms of your items because attack speed items can work really well on the Aphelios. But sometimes you'll see me end up with a board that might look like something like this, where this is just like an even spread of putting some utility items as well as damage items on the backline units. Of course, it's very bow and glove and sword dependent, so that goes back to when you should play this comp, when you have a lot of swords, a lot of bows, a lot of gloves. These are items that you can then convert into components to use for these backline carries. But because you have two different AD carries that can make use of different styles of items, right? So one being an attack caster and one being more of like an attack like damage like auto attacker, you have good flexibility on whatever kind of starting items you have. If you start the game off with a Guinsoo, as long as you have more towards AD items, or if you start the game off with a Shojin, you have opportunity to play towards the two of them. Now, in terms of frontline units, I think Leona, you can build Leona's going to be your main tank, so you want to build her with as many good tank items as possible. You just want to stack as much armor, magic resist, and HP as possible. Vanguard scales off HP really well, so sometimes a Warmogs might be a good idea on her, but anything is good because, like, maybe not durability because you already get some durability from Vanguard. However, something that I would say that I like to put on her a lot is something like a Protector's Vow. Leona has a really good ability when she she has like a little bit of like a stun, so it helps her to get her cast off a little bit. So I like to have a little bit of mana generation or starting mana so that you can get her cast off a little bit earlier. But it's not essential. Just make sure you have as many tank items as possible. You can also put tank utility items on your front line to optimize your backline damage, because Last Whisper and Red Buff aren't necessarily the greatest items for damage. So you can put like Sunfire, the other thing on her, Sunfire and Even Shroud. Now, for Marksman, turns out that it's really good. So a lot of times you want to play around for Marksman. However, sometimes you could also cap this board out with Vanguards, because you could just play 6 Vanguards and drop some of the other units. So here I'll just shove in an extra 2 units here. Bang. So we have 6 Vanguard. 6 Vanguard Frontline helps you to stall out longer. However, this is a board that won't really fit in unless you're like level 10, or if you're level 9 and you have an emblem, either a Vanguard emblem or a Marksman emblem. So this is a more high cap version, because 6 Vanguard is going to be so hard to deal with that your Aphelios is going to ramp up and probably win you the fight, or your Xayah is going to ramp up with the extra Marksman ability. Typically, if you're playing more towards Aphelios, more Frontline helps out a lot, because he's a Guinsoo stacker, so if you can stack those auto attacks, you'll get to that critical massive amounts of damage a little bit earlier. Or if you're trying to stabilize, a lot of times it's better if you're trying to stabilize earlier in the game, that Xayah priority is a little bit better. But either way, you shouldn't really play around 6 Vanguards like without 4 Marksmen, because it kind of feels like, especially in the current meta, it's not that great. But we'll see if things change in future patches. If you're watching this and I posted this video like, day 3 of the set, and you're watching this and it's like, halfway through the set, this board can obviously change, and maybe the right way to play it is 6 Vanguard and you drop the extra Marksmans. But typically, what you end up seeing is that you don't really strive towards any of these. When you're playing towards late game, you basically try and cap this board out with a 5 cost. That's the main way that you want to try and cap the board. So you're always going to be playing your Vanguard, or your 4 Marksman, 4 Vanguard, and these Vanguards are the ones that usually kind of work out pretty well. On level up, what you could do is drop the Silas, basically. So what you could do, if you have AP items, because usually you're going to end up with some AP items at one point, the big cap for this is Aurora 2. Aurora 2, you get the Dynamo synergy with the Jhin, so she gets her cast off a little bit earlier. But this Aurora unit does a massive amount of burst damage and is very strong. She is just really good. If you ever see an Aurora, Aurora 2 is a good way to cap out this board on level 9. So a lot of times if you have the Aurora 2 on level 9, now you can drop the Silas and you can just play a more expensive, more tanky Vanguard unit, which typically ends up being Braum, and you can play a board like this to cap out. Aurora can also pull in a unit, and some good options to pull in, things like Kabuko, Zac, Urgot, right? Urgot has Execute, which can help out your board. Zac and Kabuko have opportunity for you to spike your board pretty well. If you're not playing around the Aurora, then a lot of times on level 9, you'll still keep in your Silas, and you can also play a Garen. Garen helps out this board a lot, because basically Garen can work as a really good frontline unit. You can give him Vanguard via the God of the Net ability, and also depending on if you hit Anima Squad or Golden Ox, if you hit Anima Squad or Golden Ox, you can then give those to the respective opposite carry to give them a little bit more damage amp. So for example, you can give Aphelios, Anima Squad, give him a little bit of touch of damage amp. You can also use Anima Squad as a frontline trait to give some extra armor and MR to some of your frontline units. Or in a lot of cases, you'll hit Golden Ox, and now you can scale up the Xayah, similarly to how you scale up the Aphelios. So Garen's a great way to cap this board as well. But as you can see, it's a little bit hard. This board's very complete on level 8, and that's part of what makes it really easy. Often you can roll really deep on level 8 trying to find your Xayah 2, your Aphelios 2, and your Leona 2. There's not much to put in on level 9 unless you hit like an Aurora 2. Then you have a little bit more options in order to cap out your board nicely with the Aurora. But if not, a lot of times you're just trying to play pretty much any 5 cost, even a random, what's his name? Renekton, especially if you get a Renekton 2, could work out really well, because the Marksmans will give a large amount of AD to this Renekton, so it'll actually pop off really hard. You have Divinicorp synergy already, so you'll get a little bit extra sauce on the Divinicorp bonus. Not that it's too important, but it is pretty good, and Renekton's bonus being attack speed is something that's like universally loved by most of the units. It's something to think about. It's very flexible to just throw in a 5 cost, right? Even a Viego could just do work, because you're going to have Golden Ox synergy that you're scaling up Golden Ox anyways. So you have a wide variety of 5 costs you can play, but a lot of times this is the completed board, and that's why it's kind of hard to cap out, right? There's nothing super crazy. None of the 5 costs are going to be like absolute monsters, if anything. So a lot of times you're just hoping that you kind of steamroll the lobby and then maybe go first if you're like really far ahead and you have really good combat augments, but often you're going to end up in like that top 4 and maybe bleed out to one of the stronger boards that exists. A lot of times when you're trying to stabilize, I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again just to make sure. Aphelios is hard to do damage early game, especially if you don't have a Leona 2, because he needs time to ramp up with the Guinsoo. So if you're having trouble stabilizing, a lot of times it's better to itemize and play towards the Xayah. Just because like until your board is like really upgraded, until you have like a really strong upgraded front line, something that's like everybody's 2-starred, everybody has items, the Xayah is going to do a lot more damage because she's more burst heavy, right? She front loads the damage a lot. Aphelios needs to ramp up, so that's where it can kind of fall apart a little bit. But either way, you can itemize towards either of them depending on what your starting game is and have a relative amount of success. Now, if we're talking about some early game boards, a lot of times you're just starting out with either full casting items or your full casting AD items, or you're starting out with like attack speed items. A lot of times it's somewhere around like this Jhin Kindred line that you're usually playing around, or you can even play it from an Anima Squad variation where you're starting with Anima Squad units and a Vanguard opener. A lot of times your opener might look something like this. You might even have Nitro in, who knows. But the idea is that if you're starting out with a Guinsoo, you can start out with a Guinsoo and then play into hitting Aphelios eventually, and then playing around like the Aphelios as your primary carry. Or if you hit like more like casting items, you can play around like AD caster. But a lot of the times it's like you need to have like those gloves and sword components. Not many rods, not many tiers, not many like AP focused items. A lot of times you're trying to play towards AD, so you really want to have like those big hitter items like IE. Even a Deathblade, even though it's like feels a little bit awkward, Deathblade gives a good chunk of damage amp as well. And it can work really well with the Marksmans that scale really well off AD. But basically, if you have a bunch of sword items, you have a bunch of glove items, these are the type of openers that lean themselves really nicely into those style of comps. Now, in terms of flexible options as well, if you think about the main items that I was showing you for Xayah, as well as Aphelios, there are some other options of 4 costs that you can play around, namely MF and Zeri, right? If you have mostly attack speed items, you can play around Zeri. Zeri is really weak right now, so I wouldn't really suggest it, but a lot of times you can play into MF, making an early IE or like big damage AD item. It can pretty much work on all of the units, and depending on what your later items are, like if you have Shojin, like you're playing around Xayah, you can often stabilize around MF, because MF actually fits in really nicely with this board, because she can actually fit in with the Jhin pretty effectively. So a lot of times you might have a board where you play Aphelios, and instead of playing Aphelios Xayah, you can actually play Aphelios MF and just put the Xayah items on the MF and stabilize around that. I'm just trying to build it. I'm looking for Jhin, right? Your board looks something like this a lot of the time. So this is like your backline, then you can play extra Dynamo, and then you just play, similarly, you play Vanguards, but you can just play an extra Syndicate unit. So a lot of times it's the extra, let me just put in everybody. Doot. And where is Darius? Right? Your board will look something like this. These are like other options where they're not necessarily the greatest, because you're not playing deep into Dynamo and you're not playing deep into Marksman. So both units kind of are like half-assed, where they're not doing like their full potential of damage. But it's something that you can do to stabilize, because your items for Xayah can actually work really well on MF. Additionally, you can play something like this. This was something, it happened in PBE. I'm just showing it to you guys because like I wouldn't recommend doing this. It's probably a waste of gold, but you could play like something like this. Kindred has rapid fire and Marksman, so you can play a backline that looks something like this, and then you can play like, you can try and find a way to play Exotech if you really need it. But there's other options. That's all I was trying to point out. But either way, there are some variations. You can go a full pivot into a Dynamo board as well. That's also another option, because a lot of times you're holding on to the Jhin anyways. And what I would say is that instead of playing Aphelios and MF together, that's more of like you're trying to just playing what you hit. A lot of times it's better to just go into one of the lines, right? So for example, I would just go straight into like the full Dynamo board. That looks more like, I'm trying to find the last Dynamo unit. Morgana, right? I would just go full into like this board, for example, right? One way or the other. I would either go full into Dynamo or full into Marksman, but it is a flexible option because there are shared units between the lines, and you can often play like a Vanguard Dynamo setup. Normally the Dynamo setup, you play like, instead of all these Vanguards, you drop one of the Vanguards because you have to play the Bruiser for MF, and you play 2 Vanguard and 2 Bruiser with a Gragas and Divinicorp, right? And then you eventually cap out around what's it called? Aurora with 3 Anima Squad with the Silas and the Leona. So it's a similar idea, a similar path. I think this board's a little bit stronger, but obviously it leans more into like playing around, like zooping up the 5 costs, and it's a little bit Aurora dependent. But those are some flexible options that if you're in a pickle, if you're in a bad spot, you can kind of like find a way to stabilize around some of the other units that you hit on your roll down. But typically, it's better just to play around Aphelios Zaya and just dedicate yourself to 4 Marksman, call it a day. Or if you hit the MF and you hit an MF2, then just like slowly find a way to pivot your board into a Dynamo board, which we'll talk about Dynamos another time and maybe do a callback to this video. So, what are your conditions for success? Typically, you want really good AD items, as I was talking about before. You want to have good econ. So, even if you're playing around, no matter which board you're playing around, let me just clean this up a little bit. When you're playing around the board, it's really dependent on finding the upgraded units a lot of the time. So, you might run yourself into a problem where you don't have enough gold to hit everybody effectively. So, sometimes, here's some tips, right? Don't upgrade Jin, don't upgrade Jin, don't upgrade Kindred, don't upgrade Jinx. Jinx doesn't do that much for this board, so sometimes you don't even have to play the Jinx, just play Kindred, save money, because a lot of times if you have really bad econ, you really need to hit Zaya 2, you really need to hit Leona 2, and you really have to hit Aphelios 2. If you don't have 2-star of all of these 4 costs, it's going to be really hard for you to top 4. Often if you hit them really early, because a lot of people are playing maybe AP, because the AP lines are a little bit more popular, because Strategist is so broken right now. It's like, you know, if you're not stable and you don't win out early, then it's going to be really hard for you to top 4, and you really need to have enough gold to hit all of these units. So more gold, the better. It often will help you out. So be careful about the units that you upgrade and the units that you play around, because you really want to have these 4 costs upgraded before you can kind of progress and go to level 9, or else you might risk yourself bot 4ing really easily. You also want to have high HP when you play this comp. I wouldn't play this comp from far behind, because there's many comps that beat it out. This comp sometimes has problems, especially if you don't have your 2-star upgrades, beating rerolls, because you just don't have enough burst damage between the Zaya and the Aphelios if they're not upgraded. It has a hard time beating some of the really high cap 5 cost comps, so like Strategist Amp, for example, is going to be a hard sell for this type of comp. You're really susceptible to backline damage, so things like, you know, a Slayer comp with Shaco, or Divinicorp with what's his name, Zed, right? Things like that where they have backline access. If they just kill your Zaya or kill your Aphelios early, the comp kind of just falls apart, because you're a very frontline, backline style comp, right? You have your front line, and if they bypass your front line, then you just die. So there's a lot of times where you can easily lose with this comp, and it doesn't cap very high. So you want to play it from high HP, and you want to be a little bit ahead when you play it. A lot of it is like the tempo and the ease of playing it, that you can stabilize very easily around different units. That's like the key to being successful with this comp. You don't want to tunnel vision too hard. You know, if you hit Aphelios 2, it doesn't matter what your items are, stack all the items on the Aphelios. If you hit Zaya 2, stack all the items on the Zaya, right? Make sure that you stabilize as early as possible to make sure you have the HP in order to get your top 4. Additionally, strong combat augments help out. With this comp, if you can hit, like, you know, really good things, there's things like little buddies that can work out really nicely, because you're playing a lot of low cost units that can power up these stronger units. There's also like long distance pals, because the marksmen share AD, so you can just get like a giga juice amount of AD by playing like a long distance board. Additionally, things like deeper into any of the traits, even deeper into anima, sometimes you can just drop everything and you can play like, you know, 7 anima squad if you have anima emblems and stuff like that. There's different variations you can play like that can help you to stabilize pretty well, but ideally you have good combat augments that help you. It is pretty simple, but you often want to play for a top 4 and then call it a day. Something I didn't mention before, I'm just going to mention it really quickly now because it just reminded me. You could also pivot this board into like an anima squad kind of board where you just play like vertical anima squad. I wouldn't necessarily say this because a lot of times when you're itemizing towards this style of board, you want it to be a little bit, you want to be a little bit more careful, because a lot of times when you're playing 7 anima, you usually don't even worry about playing Marksman, because the Zaya isn't getting that much AD from it. So a lot of times when you're playing 7 anima, you're more playing like more frontline and helping the anima trait do a lot. So a lot of times you're playing like, you know, Renekton to get the Bastion synergy, and you're playing a board that looks more like this. And then maybe Dynamo and capping around Aurora too. So that is a pivot option, but it's just not, I don't consider it to be like a primary marksman pivot angle, because if you have a lot of AD items, you really only have like one main AD carry that kind of falls itself into the Zaya. So just be careful about that. But anyways, thanks for watching. Like I said before, please make sure to like and subscribe. Videos are a bit scuffed and a little bit awkward when I'm uploading them. Hopefully this one was helpful. I tried to cover it the best that I can with, you know, having to like redo all of my resources and stuff. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it helps out a little bit. I know it's not the strongest comp. I know that like people are always going to say that, like, why play this comp when you can just play strategist amp? But if you have a bunch of AD items, this is something that's a really easy, you know, put the fries in the bag, call it a day, end off with your top 4, and then move on to the next game where maybe you get like a bunch of teardrops, and then you can play pretty easily around your Annie strategist board and get your first in that way. So anyways, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you learned something, or it helped you out if you're starting out in the game, and hopefully this is a comp that maybe you can have some success with. Thanks for watching and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.